Hi, good morning, good afternoon. Thank you for joining our webinar today on architecting trust, access control for autonomous systems. My name is Kelsey Brazill with P0 Security, and I will be moderating our conversation today. Really excited to be joined by our experts, Neha from P0, the Chief Product Officer, and Lalit, also known as Mr. NHI, who's joining us from the NHI Management Group. To get us started, I'd love to just pass it over to you both to do a quick introduction of yourselves before we get into this very meaty and timely topic. Lalit?
Thanks, Kelsey, for the quick intro. Lalit Choda, founder of the Non-Human Identity Management Group. I'm an industry veteran, been in sort of IT, identity security for over 30 years, mainly within the financial industry. I've run some pretty large global IAM and HI programs, and about 18 months ago, founded the Non-Human Identity Management Group. Our mission is really about educating, evangelizing, about non-human identities, and I guess including AI agents, and really help organizations and the industry tackle, the biggest identity challenge that's out there.
Great, thank you. Neha, how about yourself?
Yep. Hi everyone. My name is Neha. I lead product here at P0 Security. I've been in the business of building and enterprise products for a long time now with expertise in both security and observability tooling. There's a lot happening in the industry right now with agentic AI and AI adoption, and I'm really excited to be here and talk about what we are doing with P0 and essentially what we are seeing within the enterprise space and around AI.
Amazing. Well, let's dig into it. I think something you said in your intro, Lilith, was, and I guess now agents as well. So I think that's a great place to start. Can you talk to us a little bit about that evolution of the NHI space to include AI agents, or does it include AI agents, and how kind of we're seeing corporate adoption and these various levels of autonomy emerge?
Sure. I think if you go back a year, right, I was at a NHI conference in New York, and I think we had one talk on AI agents or agentic AI. And now, everyone, all they talk about is agentic AI and AI agents. So clearly, I think we're way past the awareness stage. And I think we're really kind of across the industry more in sort of an experimenting stage at the moment. I'd say, roughly 8 out of 10 organizations have built or are building agentic AI agents. So clearly things are moving at a pace I've never seen before in the industry from a sort of security standpoint. I think, also look at the rapid adoption of MCP servers that allow, how you can standardize agentic AI agents in terms of how they access tools, data, services in an interoperable and scalable manner. It does feel like it's a bit of a arms race at the moment that everybody's trying to build agents. But I think we're not quite ready, I think, to really deal with the full scale and challenge that agentic AI brings. And I'm sure we'll talk about that a little bit later through the discussion. But look, fundamentally, our view is, agentic AI are really, non-human identities, but they bring completely new challenges and complexity to how you need to deal with managing, identities and identity security going forward.
Yeah, same question to you, or any reactions to Lilith's response? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, everything Lalit says resonates, and everything is everything that we are seeing out in the industry too. There's definitely a lot of hype around AI. Everyone's, again, off to the races, just trying to adopt AI in different ways and building their own agents. But as we look at enterprise customers, there's a level of caution everyone is sort of informed about, and everybody's cautiously approaching how they adopt agents. while yes, I think the ambition is to adopt agentic, enterprise wide, but we are seeing enterprise customers cautiously sort of approaching that by building a first class set of agents for use cases that they are familiar with, whether they are replacing chatbots or handling sort of certain very specific functions within the organization. So yes, a lot of hype, but at least from an adoption perspective, we are seeing folks cautiously sort of approach this, given there is a lot of unknown related to it. And as Lalit said, there is NHIs and agentic AIs pose a very sort of different risk than human users within the enterprise space. So as folks are trying to sort of build the solution, they're also thinking about how do they sort of secure that and ensure that they're doing that in a way that works right the first time around for them.
And I think just to add, I would concur with Neha in terms of when we speak to clients, and on the ground, I think most organizations are really dealing with the more sort of simple use cases, replacing kind of maybe some functions that humans are performing today, as Neha said, bots. I think some of the more complex examples of agents talking to agents and that whole complexity that I'm sure we'll talk about in a minute. I think we're really still at the very early stages of maturity when it comes to agentic AI. So I agree, it's a corporate, cautious approach. But one of the key questions we get asked quite a lot from organizations is we're really worried about the governance of AI agents and agentic AI, and they want to know how to start, from a governance standpoint and a risk management standpoint.
Yeah. And before we get into the identity and governance and security challenges that are cropping up all over the place as a result of this adoption, what's driving it? I mean, you both called out the caution that teams rightfully have in terms of like these early phases of adoption, but why is it feels like an inevitability of companies. I think Neha used the term like an arms race to get these agents built and deployed. Um, for either of you, what do you see as creating that kind of pressure cooker environment here?
I mean, AI definitely helps sort of increase productivity, at least from what we have seen with the AI tools out there. So there's definitely an interest to adopt AI technologies or, build your own agents to drive that productivity within within an organization or within the enterprise space. So there's a lot that AI can enable that reduces sort of like the learning curve that we dealt with previously, and AI sort of helps ease a lot of that initial sort of the getting started phase. So there's definite, and it enables, allows people to sort of opens up a whole net new use cases or things that you can do with it. So there's definitely an interest in adopting AI and, developing your agents to sort of increase that productivity factor within the organization. At least that's what we are seeing. And yeah, and that's why, the race to sort of build your own agentic solutions to improve processes that you have within your own organization, making it easier for your customers.
And I think, look, just to add, they are the new like digital employees, right? They operate 24/7. They can do things that humans can do, but tenfold, hundredfold more efficiently and faster. Even our small group, is leveraging, AI and agentic in many different ways, and we're now able to sort of punch, way beyond our weight, in terms of what we can do from a productivity standpoint. So I think the comment about arms race is true because some people are going to be winners here. There's going to be a lot of losers, and I think it's fascinating what's going to happen with organizations, as they adopt agentic. It's going to be such a huge competitive advantage, and it's going to totally dramatically change the way things are done. The small players can compete with the big players. The big players will get more efficient. So it's inevitable that the adoption of agentic AI has got to be a top priority for pretty much every organization out there just to survive.
Yeah. That's really helpful. I think that keeping that tension in mind as we move towards speaking through some of the challenges here really sets the scene for what corporations are up against in terms of needing this technology to compete, but also thinking ideally proactively about the security and governance measures that need to be in place to do it as, effectively as possible. Um, your course recently added a module on AI agents, and something that I pulled here and paraphrase a little bit were some of the top level challenges that you have seen or spoken to as emerging as this adoption and this autonomy increases. Can you talk us through kind of the highlights here, what's most critical for folks to keep in mind?
Sure, look, I think we could spend the whole hour just talking
Right.
about the challenges or even more. Look, I think firstly, I would say, look, corporate adoption, so what we discussed earlier, is outpacing, our ability to manage those agents and the identities that they use. I think, with NHIs, 25 to 50x, multiplied, compared to humans, with AI agents, that's going to go, exponentially higher. We're already seeing, you know, thousands of agents being created. People are talking about billions of agents over the next few years. A few per human. And then with agentic AI, identities are created on the fly as well. So we're going to see a massive explosion in, identities. But unfortunately, our kind of existing tool sets for IAM and PAM are really not catered to deal with agentic AI. Other things, who has access to an agent, which humans can use it, what privileges does the agent have? And it's going to be, we're seeing definitely organizations rushing and then granting these agents kind of excessive privileges because they need to do, a broad brush set of activities. So we're seeing big problems with identity sprawl and excessive permissions. I guess as people have been adopting MCP servers, a lot of them are using static credentials. So we're just kind of creating bigger, identity issues, that already exist in the industry with NHIs. So I think we're not learning from the mistakes that have been made around non-human identity management. So I think, we've got to think about, you know, being smart about how we manage AI agents from an identity management standpoint. I think other things, given their dynamic, autonomous nature, how do you start enforcing, policies that are going to be dynamic? You have to apply real-time context and intent, and do authorization based on, what the real-time activity. So there is starting to be a lot of complexity already. How do you then monitor, the complex web of interactions? Um, you know, the process is no longer deterministic, right? It's going to be very different day to day. So how do you monitor? How do you look for anomalous behavior? It just throws out so many new challenges and complexity. Um, I'm sure Neha's probably got some good thoughts and perspectives on that as well.
Yeah,
So,
I concur with everything you said, Lalit, in terms of the complexities the agentic stuff introduces. And here, I think when folks start thinking about agentic, the first thing comes to their mind is visibility, and they think about like, hey, if I have visibility into the agents, that's enough. And I like for complete governance, I feel like visibility is important, but it doesn't do the job of reducing the risk. What really matters is understanding what actions are possible and where guardrails are missing. So as teams are looking at which actions agents and workloads are allowed to perform and under what conditions, they need to be able to identify some of these high impacting operations, especially if, agents are accessing customer data, they're modifying production systems, and ensure that these are explicitly governed and not implicitly allowed. And again, the focus also, as to your point, is beyond all of that, is like it should focus on where access decisions are made, even for the agents themselves. And you were talking about, a lot of these agents sort of having very similar to NHI's, like long-lived service accounts that are over permissioned or broadly scoped. There's no real control at execution time. So I think, as you think about sort of AI adoption and agentic applications, definitely there's a need to extend some of the similar principles that we use for PAM uh, in within the agents themselves. That's by introducing strong guardrails that evaluate the identity, role, and context of when an action is taken and by whom, and ensuring that agents are given access to only things that they need and block anything that falls outside of the policy. So you're essentially ensuring the agents have that ephemeral, just in time access to what they need, as opposed to sort of, giving them the keys to the kingdom to access everything.
Just a question, I guess, given, how complex, the interactions are going to be with autonomous agents. They can take different pathways every day, start talking to different endpoints. Do you think we have the tooling in place today to deal with kind of sort of dynamic policies that are evaluated kind of at runtime? Or do you think that's an area that needs to mature within the kind of vendor space, sort of within capabilities that you're building, at P0?
Yeah, I mean, we do have like the initial set of capabilities, and fundamentally, I think the principles of how access is managed, although these are autonomous agents, is not very much outside the scope of what, some of the at least access management or authorization tools can do. And so I think at the end of the day, the concepts of like what resources being accessed by whom, and essentially what the context or identity behind that, if those three things are clear, there's a lot of principles that can be extended out to agentic applications themselves. And that's exactly what we are doing at P0, is evaluating at runtime by creating a set of these policies at configuration time on what an agent can access, and evaluating the identity of what's calling the agent can help sort of scope what the agent should have access to at runtime. uh, can I is this capability developed to its full maturity across the vendor space? I don't think so, because it's still sort of developing with how AI agent development or agentic application development is sort of progressing or maturing in the space. But there's definitely enough, I mean, from a tooling perspective, there's enough out there that can help sort of initially help customers sort of secure access to or scope access to what agentic applications or agents have at runtime.
Okay, thanks. I think just one other thing to add, just on the slide, we talk about regulation and compliance. Clearly, you know, regulations at the moment are quite fragmented globally. Even within the US, there's kind of obviously different regulations, within each state. I was fortunate enough to be at the OWASP Top 10 Risks for Agentic Applications launch in London a couple of weeks ago. And in one panel session, they were highlighting that some kind of auditors, regulators are asking that you need to be able to prove, right, what's going to be the process paths, the outcome of an AI agent, and given kind of it can be autonomous and non-deterministic, how do you prove, what you designed the agent to do is only doing what it's supposed to do in terms of its scope. And there was an interesting angle where they were even saying, you need to be able to prove the outcome, as you continually upgrade your AI LLM models, and prove that the agent isn't now able to do something different to what it was originally designed to do. So I think there's more questions than answers. How do you prove an agent, is doing what it was designed to do and nothing more? I think is very, very difficult conceptually. So yeah, I think we do need to think a lot about regulations and try and adopt standards as they evolve and mature in the coming years.
And on that note, can you talk a little bit about like recent history, what we've learned from the what you've seen not too long ago with NHI and like actually achieving some of these what might feel more aspirational right now, protocols and standards around regulation?
Yeah, look, I think the key thing from looking at the NHI world, we've got to move away from kind of static credentials. Um, that just doesn't work in the world of agentic AI, just given what we've just discussed about everything being more dynamic, autonomous, and you need to be able to do real-time authorization based on intent. So I think leveraging dynamic, ephemeral, just-in-time credentials are key to building AI agents, um, and therefore only granting the access that you need at the time based on what you intend to do. I think that's the main takeaway. I think, but look, I think the other thing people shouldn't forget is you still have to manage the full life cycle of an agent, right? As Neha said, you need to understand what it is, who owns it, who has access to it, what can it do, what is it connected to, when you no longer need that agent, are you shutting it down and its associated identities? So the full life cycle is going to be very important around managing AIs and the whole governance. How do you deal with, one agent talking to another agent, and how do you set up policies between, agents to agents? So again, I think the foundations of NHI management and security, are core to building AI agents. But as I said, there's definitely new challenges that are coming our way.
Great, thank you. Well, if we start to think about how we can effectively and more proactively think about governance and access management for these agents and MCP servers. Um, a principle that you've created a lot of education around, Lalit, around NHIs more generally, is the shift from static to dynamic governance. Can you speak to what this looks like from your point of view in terms of this new agentic world?
Yeah, I guess I feel we've probably covered a little bit of this already. So may have jumped the gun a little bit on this question. But, as we said, you know, um, the old world, everything was very static in nature. You had, software workloads or machines that were very deterministic in their nature, right? So would have typically static credentials and fixed permissions and policies that were enforced. You would extract all your permissions at runtime to say, I'm this identity for this workload, you know, grant me the required permissions based on my role or what I need to do. And that's it, right? You would then get on and do your job and then talk, to all your, downstream systems, databases, and other services. So that whole model of kind of being very deterministic, static in nature, it just gets completely flipped on its head with agentic AI, where you need to effectively, at runtime, understand what is it that the agent's doing, and then effectively at every decision point from there onwards, every action that that agent may perform, in particular as it talks to, any downstream services, another agent, data source, an API, a service, given that, those could be brand new paths that agent may take. Some may not be pre-planned. Every intersection point, you're going to have to check, you know, can I do what I'm looking to do? Can I talk to another agent? And then you've got other complexities, right, in terms of use cases where, humans are using agents, and then how do you, you know, share those credentials? What do you pass through from your initial, engagement with an agent? And if that agent now needs to act on your behalf and talk to other downstream sources, other agents, how do you federate those user credentials? So again, I think it's very, very dynamic. Is really the path we need to take. Um, and I think the other area that becomes very challenging is how do you monitor and control what your agents are doing, what actions they're performing, um, because now they're very dynamic by design, um, and because they could be crossing many different endpoints. The old days of just being able to know how to monitor, look for certain alerts, and SOC teams looking at those events or anomalies. In the new world, you may have to pull data from so many different sources and look at so many different dynamic activities that an agent's performing as it engages with other services. I find the whole monitoring side of things completely fascinating, of how we're going to be able to understand what an agent's doing, and is it doing what it's supposed to, or is it now doing things that were not part of its original design. Um,
Right.
so I think those are some of my thoughts around how you now need to move to more dynamic governance and monitoring.
Thank you. I appreciate you digging deeper there. Like you said, we could probably talk about all of this for hours. But Neha, I'd love to move to you for your perspective, especially like with P0's focus being on just enough and just in time access to sensitive resources, production environments. What are you seeing in terms of some of these earlier customer use cases, and what a practical application of that dynamic policy enforcement actually looks like for folks that, want to go out tomorrow and start taking actual steps towards getting ahead of some of these challenges that we've discussed today?
Yeah. So when we talk about dynamic policy enforcement for agentic access, we're really talking about making decisions at execution time and ensuring that there are no baked-in permissions for agents upfront. In practice, a lot of these agents act by calling tools, so whether these are internal APIs, MCP tools, or backend services. Now, dynamic policy enforcement will mean that every one of those tool calls is evaluated in real time based on identity, context, and the intent for why the agent's trying to call any of these tools. So the P0's policy engine will look at who the agent is acting on behalf of, what action it's trying to perform, and under what conditions. So, whether that's an access by an agent, that's a customer support agent that is trying to access a Snowflake data store. Ideally, the agent, based on the identity that it has, should only be accessing data for one customer, but is trying to access data for multiple customers. Now that's a problem, and that's something that P0 can flag at runtime. So based on, again, what's calling the agent, the context and the intent, and what action it's trying to perform, that's sort of like the dynamic policy enforcement piece that P0 can evaluate, and ensure that at runtime we can flag some of these behaviors and ensure the agent is forced to act in a way that it is provisioned or it's intended to. So if it shouldn't access all customer data, that's something that can be blocked straight off. Or if it's configured to say, hey, if you do need elevated permissions, what's the process to get that to access that additional data? So here I think a few key concepts are essentially that identity propagation. So the agent is not operating under broad shared service account. Instead, it's carrying the user or workload identity with it in some capacity, and that identity is used to filter out what tools an agent can even see, or authorize to take a specific action. Again, I think some of the other principles that Lalit talked about were around scope and duration as well. So dynamic policies will avoid any of that standing access. So if an agent needs an elevated privileges, as I talked about, to production data, that access can be granted just in time, scope to a very specific action, and automatically revoke when the task is complete. Now, what makes this practical is that enforcement is happening before the action is executed and not after. You're not depending on audit or detection to figure out like what the agent did. If a user or the thing that's calling the agent isn't allowed to perform an action directly, then the agent sort of forced to act on, cannot do it on their behalf either. So a lot of like in real terms, like dynamic policy enforcement is actually turning these agents from powerful but risky actors that can be, uh, can do any actions to into controlled extensions of existing identities and access models, and operating within, with the same sort of least privilege just in time principles enterprises already rely for, like humans or non-human identities, and it's consistently applied for agents. That's how at least we are thinking about dynamic policy enforcement, and that's where we see our customers use it as well, is by sort of adding the P0 control plane on top of what they have with their MCP servers to do that just-in-time access for their agents instead of giving it broad permissions.
Great. Thank you so much. We went through 30 minutes pretty quickly here. So to our audience, please submit your questions in the chat. If we don't have a chance to get to them, we'll be sure to follow up with you offline. But I'd love to get some closing thoughts from you both, circling back to kind of that topic that we started off with at the top of the webinar about the tension between the very real business incentives to drive the acceleration of this adoption and the need to defend against some of the challenges and risks that we've talked to today. What is your guidance for the security and identity leaders that are juggling both of those elements that might seem at odds with each other? We'll let
Yeah, you want to?
first.
Okay, I'll
Yeah.
kick off. Yeah, look, I always focus on the basics, the fundamentals, and as both of us have said, the core foundational principles of IAM, are not really that different, when it comes to agentic AI, right? So I think start slow, focus on your overall governance approach to how you're going to start, trialing out, and growing your agentic kind of infrastructure, and obviously focus on the basics, the fundamentals, like we've discussed, least privileged, make sure everything's real time, make sure you understand the inventory and who's got access. But look, I think one thing again out of the OWASP launch, there was a lot of discussion around making sure you come up with a clear strategy and architecture around how you're going to manage your agents, and you need to make sure identity is at the core of your control plane, right? And that's coming out from the top 10 agentic applications. 4 of the 10 are all related to identity. So I think that's the key thing to take away is you've got to manage, identities. That's your core control plane. And whether you're looking at your internal architecture or looking at products like P0 or others that are kind of developing, I think AI agents are going to put a different challenge right beyond what we had with NHIs, where I think having the right architecture and tooling to support and manage kind of this crazy growth that we're going to see in agents and then shadow AI that's occurring at the moment, it is going to be critical to make sure we can manage this stuff safely and securely. Otherwise, I think the kind of breaches that we've seen already with NHIs are just the tip of the iceberg if we continue to follow those bad principles of managing static credentials and, hard coding them, making them easy to discover with agents, then the impact, the risks are going to be much, much more significant, to all industries that are out there. So I think start slow, start with the basics.
Yeah, I'd agree with everything Lalit said. Like, start slow, start with the basics. As you're designing your agentic solutions, ensure that you're paying attention to, as Lalit was saying, or to the identities, and use all of the best IAM principles here, and see how you could extend, how you could introduce these guardrails, use some of the capabilities like a dynamic policy enforcement as you design these systems for the agents to ensure they have just in time, just enough privileges to do what they need to do without slowing down productivity, but at the same time you're not throwing the kitchen sink of uh, basically access at the agents, so you can control how they behave within your production environments.
Great, thank you. It sounds like the hygiene and governance is as important as ever, is what I'm hearing from you both. And really appreciate your time today. Unfortunately, we are at the end of our time, but if anyone is looking for more in-depth education on this topic or NHI management more broadly, I can't recommend Lalit and the NHI Management Group's self-paced course enough. So please check that out. And if you're ready to take some steps to address this new stage of agentic AI being very real and starting to access your data and being a more prevalent part in your workforce, then please reach out to P0. We'd be happy to show you a demo of some of the solutions that Neha touched on today. Lalit, Neha, thank you for your time and your expertise. Looking forward to many more conversations.
All
Thank
right.
you.
Thanks, everyone.